Well, we begin in Senegal, where President Macky Sall says elections that were supposed to hold on the 25th of February will now be postponed indefinitely. Sall announced the delay during a televised address to the nation, citing a dispute over the candidate list. It follows what has been a turbulent few months ahead of the vote after opposition figures Ousmane Sonko and Karim Wade were both disqualified from the race. It's the latest political crisis to hit the country, which has been one of Africa's bastions of stability. Nicholas Rushworth reports.
Senegal's presidential vote is postponed without any indication of when it will take place. The Senegalese president Macky Sall made the announcement in a televised message to the nation.
I will engage in an open national dialogue to bring together the conditions for a free, transparent and inclusive election.
Sall is not seeking another term. He made the announcement just as campaigning was set to begin in what is considered one of Africa's most stable democracies. It is the first time a presidential election has been postponed in the country. Reaction was not favourable on the streets of Dakar.
Honestly, as a citizen, I do not agree with the decision Macky Sall has taken. He could do better.
This year's presidential vote has been dogged by controversy, including clashes that resulted in Sall announcing he wouldn't seek re-election and the disqualification of 2 opposition leaders by the highest election authority, including Ousmane Sonko, who finished 3rd in the 2019 presidential election and who is seen as a favourite among young people. Sonko has alleged a clampdown on the opposition, which Sall's government denies.
Well, let's cross over to Dakar to speak to our correspondent Sam Bradpiece now. Good to speak to you, Sam. So the country was gearing up to head to the polls in just under 4 weeks. Now that's been paused with no date in sight. What exactly has gone on here?
Well, Macky Sall has essentially suspended the electoral process. And that's his motivation for doing so, is that he says the Constitutional Council has been corrupted. There are various allegations against the Constitutional Council, which is a body which selects, which validates the candidacies of people looking to run in the presidential election. I'm sorry, I think we're having some issues here.
Yeah, it sounds like we have just lost you. Are you still there? Okay, we are just
Yes, I'm still here. I'm getting a lot of feedback, but we'll roll with it.
Okay.
Yes, essentially Macky Sall has said that the Constitutional Council has been corrupted, and that this being the case, it wouldn't be sensible for the presidential election to go ahead, because whatever the result, the loser could always say that the process wasn't a legitimate one, therefore undermining the whole electoral process. And given that Senegal has recently gone through a period of pretty intense political violence, with dozens of people killed in clashes, this is something that the president said he was keen to avoid. So that's the official line on what's happened here. The unofficial line, and what many people here in Senegal believe, is that the president was worried about the potential outcome of this election. He was worried that his chosen successor, the Prime Minister Amadou Ba, wouldn't do very well in the polls. Despite his high position, Amadou Ba isn't a very popular public figure. He's not very well known, and some analysts would say that he's also not particularly charismatic and doesn't have what it takes to win at the polls. So that's what some people are suggesting is really going on here.
And what's the mood like where you were? Obviously, people were preparing to head to the polls. They probably had in mind who they were going to vote for. How are they feeling?
Well, we've already heard various opposition candidates voicing their discontent at what's happened here. Some have gone as far as to call Macky Sall's decision high treason. Others have described it as a kind of constitutional coup d'etat, or an institutional coup d'etat, with the president essentially launching a power grab, hoping to sustain himself and his party in power kind of indefinitely, really. And that view has been echoed on the streets of Dakar. People we've spoken to downtown have all pretty much echoed this line of argument, saying that really what's happened here today has been the undermining of Senegalese democracy as a whole.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. We'll be crossing back to you in just a moment. For now, we're going to speak to Douglas Yates, who's joining me in the studio. Thank you so much for joining us, Douglas. You're a professor of political science at the American Graduate School. Now, this is obviously a surprise turn in the country that's long been seen as one of Africa's most solid democracies.
Right. This is perhaps Africa's most solid democracy. It's a country, it's never had a coup d'etat. It's in West Africa, a region that's lousy with coup d'etats right now, 6 coup d'etats in the last few years. There's no threat at all of a coup d'etat in Senegal. It has 3 peaceful transitions of power, 1982 to Abdou Diouf, 2000 to Abdoulaye Wade, 2012 to Macky Sall. I mean, each of those transitions, those terms came to an end with the original sin, which is once a president comes to power, usually as a clean person trying to fight corruption, they slowly get corrupted by power. And at the end, Macky Sall, who had come in as a reformer, someone who wanted to clean up Senegalese politics from the dynastic ambitions of Abdoulaye Wade, which is why Karim Wade has been excluded, he himself had the temptation to present himself for a 3rd term, and that destroyed his camp's chance. And ever since then, we've had the opposition on the rise. And now he's been trying to clean up the mess that he created. He should have designated a successor 2 years ago.
So what exactly is going on in Macky Sall's head? Can you explain to us? Because he says he doesn't want a 3rd term, yet the vote where his successor will be picked has now been postponed indefinitely.
This has always been the temptation. Leopold Sédar Senghor came into power in 1960, and he wouldn't let go. He finally prepared a succession 22 years later, the temptation of power. Same with Abdoulaye Wade. A man had been in prison. He lived here in exile in France. He came to power with popular support, and at the end, he wanted to hand power to his son. And Macky Sall has this same temptation. I think what's going through his head is he would have liked to have been president longer. He realizes he can't, but he's afraid because if his opponents come to power, they might do to him what he did to Wade. That is, investigate his corruption. He's an oil engineer, former minister of mines, who's presided over Senegal's entry into the oil curse of Africa. And there's substantial reasons to believe that he may have been involved in corruption. And with his main opponent, the man who would probably win, Ousmane Sonko, if he was allowed to present himself, a tax inspector who wrote a book about oil corruption, it's possible Macky Sall's thinking, I can't let this guy in.
And some of the strongest opposition leaders, as you just mentioned, Ousmane Sonko and Karim Wade, they're both disqualified from the race. How strong is the opposition that's left in this?
Well, what's interesting is the man who might become president is an unknown. He's a man who's called Sonko's clone. His name is Bassirou Diomaye Faye. Honestly, I've been studying Senegalese politics for 3 decades. Registers nothing. He's a former tax inspector, an anti-corruption activist, a supporter of Sonko, and Sonko, although he's disqualified, has thrown his endorsement to this man to replace him. And it's very possible that a total unknown will become president, and that's a wonderful thing about democracy.
Douglas Yates, thank you so much for joining us. Douglas Yates is a professor of political science at the American Graduate School here in Paris. Thank you for joining us. We can cross over back to Sam Bradpiece, who is standing by for us in Dakar. Sam, if you are with us, just wanted to ask you, what's next now for Senegal?
Well, there are so many unknowns at this point. The president, Macky Sall, has called for a national dialogue in what is clearly a bit of a political crisis for the country. It's interesting that he uses the term national dialogue because this is also what pretty much all of the West African coup leaders, I'm talking about places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, whenever there's a coup, there's a call for a national dialogue. And it's interesting to see the president using that language. In a sense, it means very little. What many Senegalese people will be keen to see is some kind of concrete program as to when this election will be held. At the moment, it's delayed without any fixed date. This, in theory, could be in years' time. We simply don't know at this point. So that's one of the big unknowns. There are also unknowns surrounding the fate of various opposition candidates who currently find themselves in detention. I'm thinking notably of a man called Bassirou Diomaye Faye. He was a successor, essentially the plan B to the firebrand opposition leader Ousmane Sonko, who's also in detention. Bassirou Diomaye Faye has had his candidacy greenlit by the Constitutional Council and was considered a very serious presidential contender. But if between now and the eventual holding of an election, he is found guilty in a court, he could be eliminated as well. So that leaves the door kind of wide open, really, in terms of this presidential contest, when and if it actually takes place.
Sam Bradpriest, our correspondent in Dakar, thank you so much for your insight. Let's move to other world